Hello there, and welcome to a very special edition of The Libertarian Listener with me, Chris Wilkinson. And it's going to be a special roundtable discussion on the lockdown. I'm joined by representatives from 4 parties within the UK, and they are Harley Dalton of the UK Liberty Party, Sean Finch of the Libertarian Party, James Hunt of the English Democrats, and Chris Mendes of the Foundation Party. Welcome to you all. So the format for this discussion will be that each representative will be invited to explain a little about their respective parties by way of an introduction. Substantive questions will be based broadly on the theme of the lockdown and its implications for freedom and liberty in the United Kingdom. Each participant will be able to make an initial statement on each question before opening to free-form discussion. And there will be a segment for closing remarks towards the end of the session. So the first segment is introductory statements. These are going to be about 1 minute each, and I'd like to invite Harley Dalton to start off.
Yeah, so as you rightly say, I am from the UK Liberty Party. We're a relatively new party. I think we only established ourselves in our current form probably about 9 or 10 months ago, something like that. We are a party for the entire liberty movement. We kind of recognise that the UK is in a position that's quite a long way away from what libertarians, anarchists, classical liberals would consider to be acceptable in terms of the relationship between the state and its people. And so we advocate on a broad basis for the reduction in any circumstance of the state's power, influence, and reach. So that would be the reduction of taxes, regulations, laws, wherever they're proposed, and the opposition to any law which grants the state more power than it already has.
Excellent. And Sean Finch.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, hello, my name is Sean Finch. I represent the Libertarian Party. The party was set up in 2008 and was born out of the financial crash of 2008. What makes us different from most parties is that not only are we focusing on civil liberties, we're also focused on economic liberty. And I think personally this lockdown that we have now captures both of those two things. Not only are our civil liberties being trampled on, but also our economic liberty, which is equally as important, if not more, that many parties don't usually focus on. The whole lockdown is, I think, now anti-science. I think it's anti-human, because human beings like freedom. And I think these last couple of weeks, where we've seen both lockdown protests and the Black Lives Matter protests, in my opinion, this just shows that many people, although they may not be able to admit it openly, they don't believe that this COVID-19 is as serious as the mainstream media and politicians would like to think that they are. We've just issued a statement saying that we are totally against the lockdown and we wish for it to end as soon as possible. Thank you.
And James Hunt is next.
Thanks, Chris. I'm James Hunt. I'm representing the English Democrats. It was a party originally founded in 2002 by members of a campaign group for an English Parliament. Since then, the policies have, of course, been expanded on. So independent English parliaments, the House of Lords voting system, proportional representation, the ability to recall members if they depart from the manifesto they were elected on, English Bill of Rights, and the evolution of non-strategic government expenditure to the shires and developing cities. It's a party which has a wide range of policies that are quite liberal in the sense of it believes in power to the people. One thing we do say in the manifesto is we're committed to government of the people, by the people and for the people, and those with power to affect our way of life must be answerable to the people. And I think that's very relevant to the topic we're discussing tonight.
Last but not least, Chris Mendes.
Thank you, Chris. Well, we live under an ancient establishment that thinks it knows best. It cares very little about how the people think and feel. Politicians think they are the primary source of our prosperity and happiness, but few problems are solved top down, and often problems in the end are made worse. The Foundation Party has a very different attitude. We want people to be treated like adults and free to steer us all to a more inspiring place. Reducing our taxes, for example, would mean more money is spent more productively by the people. Freer markets would mean businesses can more rapidly innovate and expand for everyone's benefit. Devolving powers to local communities would mean more tailored decision making, and the end of institutional political correctness would mean not policing what people say and think. In short, we believe absolutely in liberty and democracy. We want to maximise freedom of choice and bring about a more productive and happier bottom-up society. Because, as our motto goes, the people are the masters and not the servants.
Excellent, thank you all. We move on to the first question of the night, which is, has the lockdown violated fundamental liberties and freedoms in Britain? Are laws protecting or harming the individual? And does lockdown challenge the state's assumed legitimacy? The initial response for this will be 2 minutes each. I'd like to invite Sean Finch to open.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. The lockdown has indeed violated our timeless civil liberties. This is unprecedented that a state has acted this way. And as I said in my introduction, that it has forced people not only under house arrest, but there's also given powers to state actors, police, disproportionately to what their original intention was. The PDM principles, government are telling businesses that they cannot operate. I've been a lockdown skeptic since day one. I don't see the evidence that lockdowns work. I think that it's being used in order to pass certain rules and possible legislation behind closed doors under a distraction of this lockdown. And overall, as I said earlier, it's anti-human because humans like freedom. And I think that the more that this goes on, will be absolutely destructive to our society and its economy. So I want this over with, and it's totally against civil liberty.
Excellent. Moving on to James Hunt.
Thank you, Chris. Well, I'll speak more in my personal capacity than so much the English Democrats, if that's all right. One thing the party has done with the likes of Robin Tilbrook is we have actually at least issued court papers to the government to try and challenge them on the lockdown. I personally believe that liberty with this lockdown, as you'll know, I've been absolutely against it from day one. Never in history have we locked down the healthy to look after the sick. And I believe that the raft of legislation they awarded themselves was just unprecedented. Never in Britain did I think we would descend to such madness, but in a time of panic, people have happily given up their freedom for safety, and you never should do that. That's my take.
Okay, moving on to Chris Mendes.
I can live with a very limited, brief lockdown because it's not about protecting me against myself like a nanny state would. It's about protecting someone else from harming me and vice versa. It's an external threat. And I think in that classical liberal definition, freedom is yours to do with what you may as long as it doesn't encroach upon the freedom of somebody else. And so I appreciate this might not command unanimous agreement amongst all libertarians, but I, for one, can live with a limited lockdown. I hate it. I absolutely hate it, but it's a very rare exceptional circumstances. But let's be absolutely clear. The original objective here was to prevent the NHS from being overwhelmed, causing many deaths on top, COVID and non-COVID related. But that was achieved back in April. The London Nightingale Hospital capacity is, 4,000, and by the end of April, it's reported it treated 41. Today, however, I can't see any justification for the lockdown at all, period, let alone nowhere near this length. People were very scared at first, thinking it would either kill you or seriously harm you. But what we know now is that it's mild symptoms for overwhelmingly most of the population. And if you go down to a certain age level, you're more likely to be harmed by a bolt of lightning. I think if you're 65 plus or you've got underlying health issues, I think you should self-isolate on a voluntary basis. But the rest of us need to get on with our lives. I think it's a gross violation of our individual liberty, and people should be free to make their own decision about their own health now without threat of penalty or arrest. I think there's much to say about the overzealous nature of the police, which I think in some cases has been questionable and in other cases absolutely disgraceful. Perhaps we'll touch on that shortly. This has been incredibly harmful, not just now, but in the future, and with the economic consequences in particular. Taxes are going to rocket, everyone's going to be squeezed. And so I think that the consequences of this are going to be quite horrific indeed, very harmful, and I think it needs to end as soon as possible.
And Harley Dalton.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I think it's quite obvious that the lockdown has violated the fundamental liberties from that kind of philosophical perspective. But I think as Chris touched on a moment ago, let's answer that from a purely pragmatic standpoint about whether it's helped or harmed individuals. And from an economic perspective, I think it's becoming absolutely clear that the lockdown is harming far more people than it's protecting. And, you know, one of the things we discussed in our podcast together last week, Chris, was how few people have an understanding of general economic principles. And it's kind of to be expected. People don't really think in that way. They don't think beyond the immediate outcome of policies because in many ways they're not equipped or educated to think like that. but we should at least expect it of our politicians. And I think that our government and the opposition, who are supposed to hold them to account, have failed to do this. They've failed to perform the role that gives them their legitimacy. And it's we, the people, who are going to suffer for it. You know, in terms of the positive effect of the lockdown, what's the evidence that the violations of our fundamental liberties and all the economic trouble that we're in now has been worth it? If you compare countries around the world, there isn't any clear evidence that one approach is better than the other. So if you look at, for example, Sweden or Norway, Belgium or the Netherlands, the UK and Japan, some have had soft measures, others not. And there's no pattern of success between them so far. But the countries with softer measures are coming out with encouraging economic signs, whereas we're staring down the barrel of a depression. Some say the worst economic contraction for 3 centuries. We've subjected our old and vulnerable to crippling loneliness, part-time and precarious workers to unemployment and possibly long-term hardship. We've debased the currency, wrecked savings and possibly pensions too, wiped many businesses out of existence, as well as emboldening the big state and betraying our history and freedoms. So I think it's right to look at that and say that really hasn't been worth it. And then to challenge the notion that the state should ever again have the power to do what they've done, to decide for the whole population what sacrifices and what risks are best. It's been an absolute disaster.
Excellent. Okay, so we're now opening up to 15 minutes of free discussion on this topic. Does anyone have anything to say to each other?
Well, if I could just introduce some points here, really. I was speaking with someone earlier on, I think yesterday, about what the government knew at the time. So the government didn't have all the information at the time. It had competing scientists saying, oh, it will be this bad or it'll be that bad, or perhaps the best approach is to lock down completely, or perhaps it's not. And I can understand in that circumstance, the government didn't know what to do. And so criticizing them in hindsight is in some ways unfair. It's unfair to punish them for things they didn't know. But I think in that moment, when they didn't have all the information, they had to make a choice. They had to make a choice between being pragmatic or being principled. And what the government did was to choose to be pragmatic and to choose an option that said that the ends justified the means, which I think was a betrayal of the traditions of the UK. We're not a country based upon the idea that the ends justified the means, just as America is based upon the idea of principles first and individual rights first. We have a long developed history of those kinds of ideas, and the government had the choice to honour them. And instead, they decided to undermine them in what really can only be said to be kowtowing to the media and public opinion. And I think as a result of that, because these ideas work, I think what we've seen is actually that their pragmatism has backfired quite spectacularly.
I'm glad you brought that up, to be honest. It does feel to me like the government have been led by the BBC on Twitter. One day they were proposing one thing, and it was like, okay, even to me that made sense. Like, I don't know what he said now. It was back in March, but his speech when... It was a Thursday, I remember it. It was actually that memorable. When he admitted on telly that people will die from this. I'm like, for once, a politician actually telling the truth. But then come Sunday, he'd ended up backtracking on that because of the backlash he'd got from the likes of people on Twitter and the BBC reporting it all badly. And it just shows what kind of steps the government have taken. They were adamant on opening schools on the 1st of June. A lot of parents weren't going to send them back. That's their choice. But now we're on the 10th of June, and now they're not going to enforce it, and they're not going to be looking at reopening schools until September. It appears to me like they're being driven by opinion polls, Twitter opinions, and the media instead of actual convicted government direction. That's all I can really say on that, to be honest with you.
I think that the government indeed has been doing too many U-turns, and I think that the quote Zuby, I don't know if you guys know him, he's a rapper, Zuby, and he's quite libertarian-minded. He tweeted recently, about 2 days ago, and said that if people aren't more libertarian after this, I don't think there's any hope for you. And I even had to retweet that because I thought, yeah, it's so brilliant. And this message of liberty now, it's more relevant now. And I think that people are starting to wake up and realize that the years of conditioning through academia and society and cultures itself and watching various sort of nonsense media shows, that people are starting to realize that, wow, government can't actually solve our problems. And this idea is that we are a society of liberal values, as in classical liberal values, I mean, that the government, like, you said earlier, have absolutely kowtowed to the Twitterati and mainstream media because, unfortunately, fear is profitable. The mainstream media, they could have easily chosen the Oxford model, which was, it turns out to be the far more accurate model, which looks like, but instead they chose the worst case scenario, the Imperial College model, because guess what? Fear is profitable. So they've done that. And I think now the media, they jumped on this bandwagon on what's going on now with George Floyd, which is, a terrible incident, in order to cover up their own mistakes. And slowly, COVID-19 is being swept under the carpet because most people, I think, personally, they know that this isn't as bad as the media and the government has made it out to be. And they're sort of subconsciously choosing to just look the other way. But I think we need to focus on this and actually start getting people to realize that these people are not good for you. You need to stop listening to these people, stop getting government to solve your problem, and actually believe in yourself and your fellow humans.
I just want to go back to something that you were saying, Harley, when you talked about pragmatism over principle, which I thought was very interesting. I couldn't agree more. However, I actually think it's worse than that, much worse than that. I think from the government's point of view, their priority actually wasn't so much pragmatism. I'd say their priority is not the preservation of the health and defence of the people, but the preservation of the government. I think that was their priority from day one. And I also think the priority on the part of parliamentarians, you also touched quite brilliantly on the fact that we've had absolutely zero institutional opposition in this country to this lockdown. Absolutely extraordinary. No policy is not improved by having that kind of opposition and scrutiny and so on. It's absolutely bewildering that we've had absolutely no proper scrutiny or opposition from anyone else outside the government inside the House of Commons, except it's not actually a mystery. It's because they all lack the courage to stick their necks out. They lack the courage to actually stand on principles, any kind of conviction whatsoever. And I think that, if we just bring this down to a human level, if we think about what it must have been like in the government at the time, that the government advisor that came up with the estimates they did, can you imagine if you were a government minister or even the prime minister and a civil servant, an advisor, whoever, they presumably had one of these Cobra sort of meetings or whatever it is for these top level crises. And someone sat there and presenting to you that we're going to have 500,000 deaths if we don't act. I mean, can you imagine what that does to you as a person and how you are going to be responsible for those deaths if you don't act now? That was basically the message from the civil service, experts, academia, whatever, to the government. They panicked. They've absolutely panicked, and they didn't seek additional advice or expertise. We all know the experts that have come out now with contrary opinion. Hey, Noel Ferguson himself revised his 500,000 figure down to 20,000, which for me is not far off from weapons of mass destruction in 2003. I mean, this is something that's got to be really discussed in the future. I mean, the whole thing about experts and how we should listen to them, absolutely. But we all know that actually you can find an expert to say one thing that's completely opposite of what another expert says. And in the end, you just got to pick your expert. It's not as simple as that. Absolutely extraordinary. But I think ultimately, the reason why we're having such a painful, slow turnaround now and end to this lockdown, the reason why there's a massive overreaction from day one from the government, and the reason we've got zero political opposition and scrutiny is purely a complete and utter lack of courage to show leadership and to stick your neck out at the time of when the country needed it the most.
I do agree with you, Chris, there. But I think the problem is that, yes, if someone did come to me and say, oh, look, 500,000 people are going to die, I would say, hang a minute, what's your background? And if you look at Neil Ferguson's background, he has practically predicted everything wrong for the past 20 years, like whether it be swine flu, whether it be bird flu, BSE, all of it ridiculously high numbers. And I know some people in the epidemiology community, and they honestly think that Neil Ferguson is an absolute joke. He is not respected by his peers. And this only proves to me and many other sort of libertarian-minded individuals that only someone like Neil Ferguson could exist for so long because he's basically a government employee, because the private sector would never, ever tolerate that guy's reputation. He would have been fired decades ago for producing such crap models as he has. And the government and Boris, because I remember him going on to all GMTV and all these morning shows saying that herd immunity is the best approach. And he was right. He was originally right. And it's true, you're right. You can get an expert to say whatever you want. They will come dime a dozen. But the problem was that the mainstream media and top civil servants is that they weren't allowing alternative voices to speak. As soon as And it's still happening now. Anyone that opposes the WHO's recommendations are banned. They're removed. The CEO of Twitter, I can't remember her name now, but she's actively gone on, I've seen her say in an interview, is that she will ban anyone that opposes the WHO. But the problem is the WHO flip-flops constantly. So what's said today will be changed tomorrow. So it's this ridiculous sort of idea that, there's opposing voices from Neil Ferguson. They weren't allowed to speak. And now we've got this problem. This is why freedom of speech is such an important matter. You should be able to let anyone say what they want, and you decide as an individual. You're an informed adult, you make the decision. Don't get nanny state government to tell you what one's the right thing to look at, or get these big technocrats to tell you what's right. They don't know. They're not made of better clay than us. They're just human like you and us.
Well, I think if I could just respond to Chris, I think to some degree I do see that argument about the government saving itself and doing what was best for the government. And certainly they've got a much more populist bent to them than the more ideologically driven governments that I've seen in my lifetime. But I think what was the popular opinion that the government was responding to? I think it was a prevailing view within the general population that the government needed to be pragmatic. I don't think the general population holds the same kind of principles that many people in this chat have. They have few principles at all, in fact, and don't have a knowledge, generally speaking, of the British traditions and the British principles of liberty that we value here. And so what we're seeing is the government being pragmatic because it's being asked to be pragmatic. And then as a result of that, we're seeing a reactionary force, in fact, from the government. They're trying to be pragmatic and trying to react to an impossible situation with an impossible remit, which is essentially to create one rule to rule them all, whether it's central London, rural Somerset, or, anywhere up in Scotland or Wales or wherever else it might be. And what we're seeing now, obviously, with the dithering and the delay with regards to what to do with the lockdown and an inability to express any kind of coherent objection to the Black Lives Matter protests or support for the Black Lives Matter protests, is because the information isn't telling them what to do pragmatically anymore. There is no clear route out of it. They don't know what to do, and they don't know what they're doing. And when they look around the world, whether it's, as I said before, Sweden or Japan or Belgium or Spain or China or America, there isn't a clear pattern, and it's not telling them where to go. And similarly, as Sean mentioned about Neil Ferguson has even admitted that Sweden, which didn't do what we did, has had a very similar outcome to what we had. And so I think that kind of explains it as to the position that we're in at the moment, is that the people wanted the government to be pragmatic, and it wasn't workable to be pragmatic. And they had a choice to stick to their guns, but they chose not to. They chose to go with the prevailing view, and we are where we are as a result of that.
I think I'd agree with an awful lot of that. Just to say that perhaps the severity and the length of the lockdown would have still have been very much an open question, and the government could have made a multitude of different choices there. I think I'd totally agree with the fact that, yes, perhaps there was an appetite and maybe even an expectation that the government now basically, grabs the situation by the bullhorns and steers us all through. Yeah, I can accept that. I think that's spot on, actually, from the media, but also general opinions, what you expect at a time of crisis. I can get that, but I still think the severity of it was, they've gone way further than any of us would have imagined. And food for thought, but I think we pretty agreed somewhere in the middle.
I'm just going to stop you there, because a lot of what this conversation is moving on to might be very relevant to the next question, actually. Do you believe lockdown has fundamentally altered the relationship between state and individual in Britain? In which ways, if any, and what are the implications of this new dynamic? Initial 2-minute responses. James Hunt to start.
Thank you, Chris. Do I believe that the lockdown has fundamentally altered the relationship between state and the individual? Yes. What this lockdown has shown me, and it's quite depressed me, to be honest, not literally, but you know what I mean, that how willing the individual has been to accept whatever the state has had to offer for it in return for a little bit of freedom. Even now, the government propaganda, you could say, has worked that well that even now people still believe that COVID is as deadly as, let's say, the Black Plague. So I think we're entering an era now where people are going to listen out, hand over mouth, to whatever the state has got to say for them. Unfortunately, what this new dynamic means is that ourselves, classic liberals, libertarians, we're now in the minority. We cannot be despondent about it. There always need to be the voices out there defending liberty and freedom. But unfortunately, people have thrown our ideals away, and the ideals that are good for everybody, not just ourselves. They've thrown them away for the sake of 5 minutes of security, safety, and what they thought was good health.
And Chris Mendes?
So I think the lockdown confirmed for me the unempathetic and self-regarding nature of the political class. And first of all, with regards to governments, they always overreach at times of crisis. If we think of Tony Blair in the aftermath of the bombings in 2005, they tried to get a 90 days legislation passed whereby terrorist suspects, people that have not yet been proven to be guilty of a crime, could be locked away for 3 months without any evidence and so on, which was of course defeated in Parliament at the time. But governments will always overreach and grab power at times of crisis. It's a good opportunity, and they think they need it, they'll take it. And with regards to this particular lockdown, they were advised 500,000 deaths, revised downwards to 20,000 deaths. We know it's a very small group that's really fatally affected, very tiny group, but there's no reversal at all. They're happy with the excessive power they have at this time to be overzealous and overcautious for the sake of their own preservation rather than the what's optimal and right for the people. The key to this is parliamentary scrutiny and opposition. And we have had absolutely zero institutional opposition at all. Isn't it funny how MPs have so much to say, and even an alternative plan, when their opinion about the European Union is disregarded, but when it comes to the liberty of millions of people, totally disregarded, they have absolutely nothing whatsoever to say. So for me, confirmed is the totally unprincipled, self-regarding political class who do not recognise their duty to scrutinise and stand by principles and traditions and heritage of our country and the civil liberties of millions. What's confirmed to me is the extreme overzealous action shows that the government is willing to put the preservation of itself before the people, and in the end the people are utterly defenceless against violations of liberty and freedom, big or small. And so the implication of that really ultimately is to never trust the government, even if you like the guy that's leading it for one reason or another. Never trust the government. They don't in truth have your interests at heart, and I hope that a public inquiry soon shows this.
And going now to Harley Dalton.
Thank you. So I'd say I don't just believe that the lockdown has fundamentally altered the relationship between the state and the individual, which, of course it has, and for the worse. But there's another element, which is that it's also fundamentally altered the relationship between individuals. So if you look at the nature of the criticism for lockdown breakers, at least before the Black Lives Matter protests, I don't think that you can say that it's enough in this country to just leave people alone anymore. There was a general assumption before that if you're not bothering people and if you're doing things voluntarily with other people, that everyone is responsible for themselves and that you're only risking your own life or safety, whether that's, playing sports, for example, or unprotected sex. Those are things where you might affect other people, but they're making their own choice to be involved and they're risking themselves by doing that, and vice versa. But if you look at the nature of criticism for lockdown breakers now, between neighbours, they've completely flipped the assumed, locus of responsibility. If you do something against the lockdown, you're no longer assumed to be risking yourself and no longer to be assumed to be innocent until proven guilty or healthy until proven sick, as it were. You're not doing it for yourself. If you've lost your job, if you're missing life's little joys, your sacrifice is good because you're protecting others. And if you go to the beach or visit your parents, that's unacceptable. That's evil because you're taking risks for other people. Now, people have a choice to distance from you or not, but that doesn't matter anymore. You personally, you're not thinking about how it affects the person next to you on the beach or your grandmother who happens to be starved of company. They're automatic victims, and so are you, whether either of you wants to be or not. Your actions are their consequences and vice versa. And I think the implications of that shift on a society built on the concept of the sovereignty of the individual can't be overstated. It is a precedent that can be used against anything, against anyone. And I think if used further, it will undermine this country to its eventual ruin.
And finally, Sean Finch.
Thank you, Chris. I'm going to take a little bit of a different interpretation of it, more of an optimistic spin, actually. Is that, yes, I do think that the relationship has forever changed between the state and the individual, but this is a positive, I think, because for the first time, many people have got a crash course in both civil liberties and economics. They're seeing in real time what a government does in a time of emergency. And with social media and various other advances in technology, they're actually communicating all around the world with people and seeing what's going on in all these other countries and witnessing what non-lockdown countries have successfully done and what the lockdown countries have done. And it's definitely a big difference in the sense that without the lockdown, there seems to be not as many deaths, or at least on par, than one with having a lockdown. Because I think people are seeing that this whole virus was created by a super authoritarian state which thinks little of their civilians' rights, i.e. China, the Wuhan virus, whatever you want to call it. But our solution is to become a super authoritarian state which thinks little of its citizens' rights. Two wrongs don't make a right here. The real virus here is authoritarianism. COVID-19 is but a byproduct of it. And I think, as I said, I'm an optimist about this now. I think after this, people are really going to become more libertarian-minded and actually start saying that, you know what, governments aren't as great as I've been led to believe. I think that I'm going to do things more myself. So I think personally, this is actually going to be a watershed moment. And although I think that it's going to be very hard times economically, I think once we come out of this, I think that people are going to start having more faith in themselves.
Okay, and now 15 minutes of free-form discussion on this subject. Who's kicking off?
Well, I'd just like to maybe put a counterbalance to what Sean said there. I take a much more pessimistic view. As I said before in the previous question, the government were acting on the idea from the population that the population wanted a pragmatic, unprincipled approach. And I think what I've personally seen, and this may not be the case for everyone, but what I've personally seen is the emergence of a class of armchair dictators, essentially. People who are more than happy not just to be subjected to a lockdown, but to subject others to a lockdown. And I think especially this seems to be a disease that seems to affect those on furlough and public sector workers and chattering class media personalities far more than it, affects the common man who just wants to get on with his life. There is perhaps a little bit of hope in that this kind of common good approach has required victims, and those victims will and have been almost exclusively the poor and disadvantaged who've really seen their quality of life go down. There may be a backlash, but I think the people who certainly control the narrative, whether that's the news media like the BBC, Channel 4, and the various newspapers and various radio stations, they're the armchair dictators who control the narrative. And I see no end at the moment to their reign. So I actually think that we may in the future embrace the principle, or the precedent, I should say, that's been set here, and that by and large people will just go along with what they're told to do the next time they're told to do it.
Do you mind if I come in and sit in the middle between yourselves? Let me approach it this way. I think there is some similarity, actually. There's a parallel even between the Brexit debate and our membership of the European Union on one hand, and those that might be sceptical or even opposed to the lockdown, or those that are entirely favourable of it for as long as the government chooses. I think on the one hand, you have a group of people in the population that have a healthy scepticism of power, of politicians, of government, even distrust and willingness to question, to challenge, and so on. And I think obviously a large group of those people are, obviously we're simplifying this for the sake of conversation, but I think a large group of those people would naturally lean towards leaving the European Union, wanting decision making made much more locally and more democratically and so on, and not be in favour of national political powerful bodies, let alone European ones. And on the other hand, there's a group of people that are entirely acceptance of these sorts of bodies, the status quo as it is. This is the way it works. Generally speaking, yes, we're all in this together, and you've got that kind of very virtuous kind of collective feeling, which is great. But we on this side would argue that it's not always, perhaps rose-tinted glasses and things are not that simple. And as it turns out, 500,000 people are not going to die. Actually, it's only 20,000. And look at the damage we're doing to the economy. Things are massively simple. So I think there is a kind of parallel between the two debates in that respect, different mindsets. And I just wonder if going forward, simply this division actually just kind of amplifies a bit. And it's not just politicians, it's also that skepticism against the media establishment as well that's been mentioned. So I just wonder if these might be two camps that clash more and more going forward, those that want to defund the BBC and those that are in favour of it because it's a national treasure. Both are emotional arguments, I suppose, but practical as well. But I wonder if that is particularly what is amplified, the division between those two camps, rather than one side winning over the other. Food for thought.
You're right to say that, to be honest, Chris. This country hasn't had a break since the vote to leave the European Union in 2016. We've been on edge since then, especially the Brexiteers and the Remainers. both sides played against each other by political parties. The media are also playing a part in that. And as soon as Brexit was over, 31st of January 2020, COVID hit just like that. We've had no break from this decisive nature. And then, of course, this has come along. People's nerves are already fried. They don't trust anybody. But unfortunately, they're more scared of the coronavirus. So I think it's what's led to this now, to be honest with you. You could say propaganda war, really. And I think we're seeing the results of this now. People don't know what to believe anymore. They're too afraid of everything, but they don't question should their livelihoods be destroyed. We find ourselves in a really weird predicament.
Well, if I could just come back on that, I think, as mentioned in my opening speech, I think there is a great threat that we ourselves as a society will be the ones that lead that, and that politicians and political parties and the media won't necessarily have to drive us apart. I think that, as I said, the people who are desperate to follow the lockdown and to impose the lockdown on other people have a philosophy which can lead to the destruction of our society and to the destruction of our community and a separation of two sides, similar to the Brexit debate. And I think, the principle that they put in place is that the primary purpose for doing whatever they want you to do, whether that's wear a mask or honor the lockdown, is to protect others. And that being the case, what's to stop them informing on their neighbors and on their friends and on their family for people who are engaging in actions which they perceive as endangering others and not taking into account other people? I think that's a threat. I think that's a very real threat, possibly a much worse threat than anything that the government may wish to continue doing. I think we may, in effect, have that section of society, those armchair dictators, who will try to impose this on us anyway, and they will be the source and the locus of the destruction of our communities and the trust that we have in each other as individuals.
Total agreement.
Yeah.
I actually wrote to my MP, who I stood against, so she knew me well. And she's a new MP to my constituency in Sevenoaks. Michael Fallon, I don't know if you remember, he was a former Defence Secretary. He resigned. He'd probably be in the House of Lords in a couple of months' time. But he had a new MP, Laura Trott, and I wrote to her. And I've never written to an MP before, but I thought that the Coronavirus Act and the whole lockdown incident was such an important threshold, is that I felt as though I was compelled to actually write to her. And when I wrote to her, I said that I'm highly suspicious of the Coronavirus Act legislation because it's almost as if it was pre-prepared. Now, I'm not saying that it was. Maybe it was coincidentally 258 pages are written, it seems almost overnight, but they've pushed that through with minimal scrutiny whatsoever and barely any challenge at all, because like what the other three guys were saying is that the opposition, it doesn't seem to exist in this country at the moment. We just seem to have one party in power at the moment. There doesn't seem to be any challenge at all to whatever the Conservatives do. And they've pushed it through without any scrutiny. And even Steve Baker, who is probably the most libertarian-minded Tory MP, top of my mind anyway, even he was very reluctant to pass it through. And when I wrote to Ms. Trott, I said to her, isn't it odd that the Coronavirus Act has a 2-year sunset? Why is it 2 years? Isn't that highly suspicious that it's 2 years? Why not simply 3 months? Well, it was 6 months now, but I said 3 months. Why isn't it 3 months? And I find it odd, and I think it goes back to that old saying of never let a crisis go to waste, because government could have simply used something like the Civil Contingencies Act of 2004 to do what they're doing now. They didn't need to make a new act of parliament, which is just typical of government. They seem to think that all of life's problems are solved by passing a law. And that's why I'm highly dubious of this Coronavirus Act, and it needs to be repealed immediately come September, which I believe is the 6-month renewal date. So I'm just very highly suspicious of this Coronavirus Act in general.
Well, I'm suspicious of it, but then naturally, as you could say, libertarian, I'm suspicious of all government power. So I was suspicious at how quickly it got through, and you're right, there's been no effective opposition. And for the Labour Party now to claim with all good hindsight that it could have done things better is just ludicrous. You could have done a good thing and actually opposed the legislation, but why would any of the current parties in Parliament oppose power, which gives them, well, it gives them ultimate power? Legislation that's renewed every 3 weeks, only renewed by the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, no other oversight on that renewal, just if he decides he needs it or not. I don't know, really. As I've said already, it's concerning. It's concerning. I want to remain as optimistic as I can about the situation, but with what I've seen from the nature of people, Britain has always been rebellious of power. But this time over, it really hasn't. It's been quite happy to dob in its neighbours and its friends for breaking the lockdown. Yet right now, with Black Lives Matter protests going on in London, hey, the lockdown appears to be fine. It just beggars belief. And it's all gone hell in a handbasket, really. And with what you see now with the government, it's floundering. It doesn't know how to get out of this lockdown. It wants to do it as quick as it can to save face, because it has failed in regards of people following it, at least. But then on the other hand, people are still that anxious about coronavirus. The government having to make up lies and make up special rules and new conditions just to make people think that, oh, we're following the right steps. But their lockdown policy has failed. Their plan has failed. Granted, with hindsight, we can definitely say that now, so I will give them that. But then, if they were listening to people to begin with and allowing open questioning, I think we would be in a much different position right now, but they let the power and the fear go to the heads.
I think, thinking ahead as well. I mean, this is it. The big job of us, people like us who are active in politics, trying to campaign to fight for our civil liberties, for example. I think this is perhaps a focus and a real urgent necessity for us going forward. It's whether or not these powers that they have seized with absolutely no opposition, they all agree with this, as we've said. Everybody in Parliament, no duty there whatsoever. Steve Baker cried in the House of Commons for some reason. That's the only opposition I can see. Brilliant.
He cried about it, but then he was slagging off Dominic Cummings for breaking the apparent lockdown he was crying about being imposed. So he's nothing more than an opportunist politician, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. So
cry about liberty all you want, but someone actually gives you a golden goose and you're literally baying for his blood.
James, I second that, mate. I totally agree with that. And believe it or not, I'm actually blocked by Steve Baker. I found out recently. I didn't realise that.
The libertarian in the Conservative Party's blocked the actual libertarian.
I'm very civil. I might be a bit sarky or a bit cheeky at times. But I never swear or I never throw hate at people.
Yeah.
But all I said is that, Steve, why have you done this for? Like when Ron Paul was a congressman, he famously, because he was a man of principle, he didn't care if he was the only congressman in all of Congress that voted against something, or was the only one that did vote for something. He didn't care because he was a man of principles. And people respect that. Even people who are on the opposite side of the spectrum to Ron Paul's beliefs, they still respect him for that. And I basically said that in a more, because Twitter being Twitter, they obviously limit freedom of speech and we allowed a certain amount of characters in a tweet. I sort of condensed that down and said that, basically. The next thing I know, I'm blocked. So
I wouldn't be surprised, Sean. I've been saying it for years. The Conservative Party is not a party of principle, but a party of remaining elected. Whilst that is any job of any political party, their principles went out the window a long time ago. So don't be surprised that the likes of Steve Baker portray themselves to be libertarians, but in fact, they're as authoritarian as anyone else. Give them a bit of power and they will take it quite gleefully.
Well, I think if I could just respond to something that's been mentioned a couple of times in this debate about the nature of hindsight and how perhaps we should let the Conservatives off the hook, and by extension as well, the opposition, which has done nothing, off the hook, simply because they didn't know in advance what the effect of their actions were going to be. But I would say, and I think we should try to call them out as best we can on this, is that if you are going to take on the responsibility for rules governing millions and millions of lives across a diverse nation with diverse townships and cities and villages, which each have their own local authorities. If you're going to take that responsibility, then you damn well better not make a mistake. And so I don't particularly care that they didn't have the information at the time to make the right decision. They shouldn't have exercised the power and shouldn't have taken the responsibility of that power if they were going to make the kinds of mistakes that they've made now. So I don't think we should let them off the hook by saying, in hindsight, fair enough. I don't think that's right. We need to tackle them.
That is an excellent segue into the third and final question. So the question is, should individuals fear the extent and impact of economic control and influence imposed due to lockdown? And does lockdown represent the beginning of the end for statism? Initial responses 2 minutes each, and it's Chris Mendes to start.
In terms of the economic aftermath of all of this, I mean, first of all, I'm a free marketeer. The economy doesn't grow from top-down grand designs, but from innovation and ingenuity on the ground amongst the people. Well, I want government to focus on essential national functions, to look after the least well-off, and to help us to accomplish collectively what we cannot individually. Beyond that, I think more money should be spent in the productive private sector rather than the largely unproductive public sector. And I think our situation today makes this more necessary rather than less. If we look at the recession of 2008, 2009, I mean, that's nothing compared to what we're about to face. But our recovery was not due to any grand design from politicians, from any general election. It wasn't anything to do with any international treaty. It was spending on the ground by the British people within the UK. It was businesses adapting to the situation, cutting prices, for example, or innovating internally and offering new things to suit the times and the conditions that they were in. We were spending and we managed to recover. Now, we need policies today that will give businesses a break and help them do that, and then subsequently help stimulate that spending on the ground once again, cutting corporation tax, for example, scrapping business rates, for example. They've been suspended now, but the Tories wouldn't dare suspend them permanently, and they should. Stripping regulations, absolutely. It's amazing. The rules have been recently relaxed to allow restaurants and pubs to offer takeaways, things that they shouldn't have been prevented from doing in the first place. But I fear that we're going to get the very opposite. I think that the government will use the opportunity to raise taxes spectacularly. And I also think that they will use COVID-19 as a cover story for all of the excessive debt that they've been previously responsible for. We're certainly going to see this at a local level, and it's something we're going to face, and it's something that has to be challenged. I don't have any optimism that the politicians are going to take the kind of free market initiatives and give everybody a break to actually help us recover from the ground up. I think we're going to have more put on a cape and swoop in and try and save the day nonsense from what we usually get from politicians, and it'll make the situation worse.
So we're going to Harley Dalton.
I was actually saying for weeks before the lockdown started that any kind of widespread shutdown would be absolutely devastating to the UK economy. And that mostly fell on deaf ears from anyone who I could grab the ear of. The reality is now that the big kind of macro level indicators of growing debt and money printing, borrowing and all that, those indicators are really not good when you think about where they're going to lead. And on the ground for ordinary people with lost jobs, including mine, incidentally, I think people are really going to begin to suffer soon. There is something hopeful to say, which may help the liberty movement with its messaging in a way, is that our ability to perform such a widespread lockdown is a testament to the success of capitalism and how well off we've become. You know, we can afford in a relative sense to take 3 or 6 months off in ways that would have literally killed our ancestors. And the fact that we can do this and that we can help each other with time and money and technology is something that capitalism won't get credit for. You know, the Tories won't mention it because they want to take credit for themselves, and Labour and the socialists will continue to attack it and say, you know, hey, look, socialism saved us, intervention and control saved us. And we should be, you know, loud and proud to say, actually, look what the market system enabled us to do. Look at how ungrateful these people are for your work, which made the resources that we needed to do it, and the system which enabled you to do it. I think that's a positive to take away as a kind of real world case study in the strength of market economies. The other side of that, of course, is that we've shackled that market system, which made it possible, and we've expended its reserves now. And the bill is going to come due at a time when taxes are likely to go up, and a precedent for tighter control, maybe for years to come, that's going to keep the economy shackled and strangled. And it's really going to hurt. Fewer jobs, you know, higher taxes, maybe bouts of high inflation. We should be scared of that.
Sean Finch.
Thank you. Yes, the people are going to experience massive financial burdens in the next 12 months. I don't know when, but it's definitely going to come anyway. And I think it will be a depression. I think people are going to be massively affected by it. But at the same time, people are going to wake up and actually see that it was government that caused this. Government didn't need to put a lockdown in. They've caused this. It was a state-issued lockdown. COVID-19 did not make your business close. It was a government decision which done it. And I think now, as Harley said, people are getting a crash course in economics. They're seeing that this furlong scheme that Rishi Sunak has introduced is basically more borrowing. And when you borrow more money, it's more printing of money. When you print more money, it devalues your money. The cost of living goes up and the national debt gets higher. And we're basically walking around with an invisible ball and chain, and it's called debt. And that debt's going to be inherited by our kids. And what's really worrying is that as bad as people think it is now for young people that they can't afford property and they can't afford many things, it's going to be even worse for our kids and grandchildren. And they really won't be able to afford anything. And it's at that point, they're going to look at these big socialist parties which promise them the world and say, we can give you free stuff. But the reality is that nothing is free. And what will be traded is your civil liberties. And I think people are going to realise this because they're seeing it in real time. So this is why I'm a bit of an optimist compared to perhaps the other guys, because I actually see a sunrise on this, and I think that people are going to start waking up. They're going to see that they don't need government, and as technology improves and gets better, the arguments for bigger government is becoming less and less relevant. So I'm hoping that this is actually going to be a dawn of a new day in a way for the UK and Western society in general. And they're going to start seeing that we don't need big programs, big welfareism. We can actually do these things ourselves. So I'm an optimist at the end of the day, but we are going to go through some hardships for this.
And James Hunt.
Thank you. For me, the economic impact is, well, we've all touched on it, devastating. The furlough scheme didn't need to be brought in. Why didn't it need to be brought in? Because going back to all the points raised so far, was a nationwide mandatory lockdown necessary? No. Other countries that haven't locked down at all have seemed to have fared just the same, if not better than ourselves, at least on the numbers where deaths are concerned. Are we going to feel it? Hell yeah. We're looking at a recession worse than almost 300 years. If people thought the 2008 economic crash was just a little blip, well, get ready, because austerity will need to come. How can we get out of it, though? I will actually, in this podcast, air a bit of optimism. This is the time when government needs to be proposing tax breaks, tax cuts, less red tape, less regulation. And the only way out of this, as your question asked, is to start ending statism. Thinking that the state is there to give you freedom? No. Thinking that the state is there to give you your job and your money? No. We need to end our reliance on the state in this behalf and start becoming at least more independent. And government can help with that by cutting corporation tax, income tax, business rates, all taxes, cut them. You'll help growth, inflation, and you might even encourage investment.
And 15 minutes of free-form discussion on this topic, statism, economic control and influence. Is the state too overbearing? What are your thoughts?
I think I'll kick things off then by saying this is maybe a good lesson for everybody. If the state wasn't so overbearing in its recovery plans from the 2008 economic crash, we might have weathered this much better. If they actually installed austerity and dealt with the deficit and maybe put us into a surplus, we would have dealt with this better. But they haven't. Once again, they remain too worried about what people thought of them than doing the right job. And it's left us in the situation where we are at now. You mentioned statism, and it's generally a good, or at least a funny meme going anywhere. But, you know, statism, the belief that you require permission to be free. Economics and freedom, individual thought, everything associated with freedom, all relate. So economics, free speech, everything else. Without one, you can't have any sort of freedom. So people, if they're willing to sacrifice freedom of speech but not freedom of the economy, well, it don't work like that. Or if you're willing to sacrifice freedom of the economy for freedom of speech, again, it doesn't happen that way. So I do not believe that the government will reduce taxes. I'd hope it would, but I don't think it will. So I think the government might get a sharp lesson, or all governments might get a sharp lesson from this, because the more action they take, the more they push people into poverty, or at least, hardship, the more the people might start actually pushing back.
I do agree with you, James, and I sort of regret not saying that in the previous, my answer in the last question. Within that letter, I said I wrote 2 letters to my MP, Laura Trott, saying this, and in the second letter, I gave a libertarian approach to what to do once lockdown is over, and it is basically what you've said. It's because their status, because they believe that government is the solution to all problems, is that their natural thinking is that, oh, we must raise taxes. That's just how they think. They just think that, oh, we'll pass a law or we'll raise taxes. That's the best solution to everything. I've sort of said it many times before previously to many people is that all the parliamentary parties, they don't understand economics. Even the Conservatives, which used to pride themselves on being the party of business, they don't understand economics anymore. There are these new one nation Tories. Whenever someone refers to themselves as a one nation Tory, that basically means that they're an anti-Tory. They're not a
They're
Tory.
wishy-washy.
Well, basically, it means that 9 times out of 10, they're a Remainer. They don't believe in traditional family values, and they believe usually in affirmative action programs, which I believe is a regressive idea because I'm a person that judges a person on merit rather than judging a person on their pigmentation of skin or gender or sexuality or religion. I think that's all useless. I judge a person on the individual. I don't care about whatever they are or what their personal beliefs are. I don't care about that. But in the letter I wrote, I did say that the best solution you can do is to actually cut tax, cut business rates, cut any sort of taxation that is generated from businesses, because you will get that money regardless in transaction of businesses. You'll get that naturally when people can spend more because they have more money. They will do that naturally. Because our economy is based on the back of small businesses. The small businesses are closed and all the pubs are closed. There's one in my town where I live. It was already barely breaking even as it was before COVID-19. So that's gone now. So that's another business. And I'm sure there's many thousands of other businesses that will never reopen again after this lockdown is released. It's government that have done this. It isn't COVID-19. COVID-19 hasn't come along and destroyed the business. It's woeful decisions made by government and statists that think that, oh, no, we're protecting you. Well, no, you've not. You've actually made it worse. And I think when it's really hits the fan next year, we're really going to be affected by it.
Well, this is actually the thing. I think a lot of people don't really see it that way. I think people tend to think that the economy at the moment is kind of incubated in some sort of suspended animation, as though we're kind of frozen in time, and the government has some sort of magic pocket watch. And when it clicks it, people would suddenly start hammering nails or typing emails or whatever they were frozen in time doing before. And people don't tend to conceive of the economy as kind of a living entity, and that our actions are basically the beat of its heart and the wave of its hand. And I think now it kind of lives as a kind of pitiable creature, you know, that it's shackled and it's starved of food. I think with any living creature, and especially with people who, for example, leave, you know, bodily discomforts unchecked and then they develop into serious medical concerns, I think our economy is currently going through a cardiac arrest and we're not treating it, and that will surely lead to a series of complications. I think if you look, people tend to say, oh, it's lives versus the economy, but those aren't disconnected or mutually exclusive phenomena. I think at least for the period that, you know, basic economic metrics like GDP remain lower than they were, individuals are going to suffer in their quality of life. And this is especially true for the poorest and the most disadvantaged. You know, an economy which immediately produces less than it did will inevitably be forced to sacrifice the availability of all kinds of privileges which we might once have enjoyed. And that could be reduced access to suitable facilities for the old, to recreation for the poor, to purpose for the unemployed. And that will make life miserable, in some cases intolerable, leading to increased suicides. You have deficient funding sources for the state, which means rationing of frontline public provisions like welfare and healthcare, as well as the policing of air and water quality regulations. And that means greater levels of deprivation and death as well. I think anyone who thinks that this period, you know, marked by joblessness, bankruptcy, debt accumulation, and all the collateral deaths that causes, will be a simple recovery in that kind of predictably casual manner that they say such things, is not really thinking. You know, the length of the lockdown and its, you know, consequence on the general economy will determine the longevity and the severity of the suffering that we're going to endure and we're bound to endure over the coming years. And that suffering is not trivial. And it's not necessarily temporary, at least for the short to mid-term either. People don't conceive of that, I don't think, well enough.
That's such a good point. Absolutely. I mean, you know, looking ahead, there's an awful lot of pain that this government has inflicted on us unnecessarily. I think they have overreacted, as we've said tonight. But what really worries me is the lack of institutional opposition. I mean, I can't see it in the media either. I cannot see it in our politics. I cannot see where this opposition comes from in terms of, how are we going to recover from all of this? What exactly are the pain points going to be? What measures can we take? I'm not hearing this from anybody in the House of Commons. I'm really not. In fact, I'm hearing silence for a large part, but anything that we do hear, it's administrative competence. We've got questions from the official opposition about this and that and so on, and such unprincipled opposition. So are the measures going forward going to be anywhere near like what we need? And where is the view that we hold? I think many others do too. It's just simply not represented in our institutional politics. So I do think that we've got somewhat of a job in our hands, to be honest, to try and do what we can to assert this kind of point of view. But it really does worry me, about the pain that is to come. And how, incidentally, are we going to, by the way, fund the NHS, which apparently this is all supposed to be about? By their own criteria, save the NHS. How are we going to save the NHS when we haven't got any bloody money? When we haven't got any tax receipts because all these businesses have been put out of business, or people are just now going to spend much less and save now because they've been furloughed and they've been receiving less pay, or they've been put out of work altogether. It's incredibly short-sighted. We've got a lot of pain. The government has made it worse. And I think the job on people outside of mainstream politics, we've got a huge job ahead to try and help start a conversation in the other direction, to try and help positive action, something that will help rather than hinder.
One thing that I don't think that's helped is the lack of education of how the economy works throughout the many decades. We've gone away from teaching useful home economics to students and people to now just thinking that the economy is this sort of invisible entity, like God, for example. It doesn't concern you, don't worry about it. And then the people that talk about the economy, the traders and the politicians, they borrow money whimsically. People aren't, of course, concerned where that money comes from. But I think this might be the wake-up call. People might actually start, when they hear the word economy, they won't just turn off to it and think, it doesn't concern me. Because the economy is the small greengrocer down the road. The economy is the corner shop owner. The economy is me and you as the consumer. The economy isn't this all-being superpower.
It's not men in top hats.
Yeah, basically. It's me and you spending money and someone offering a service.
I think that is something that needs to be obviously conceptualized differently in our society. I'm a little bit, although I complain about the lack of economic education in the country, I am a little bit wary about having it inserted into the syllabus, given that, there are more than one way to break an egg or something like that. There are more than one understanding of basic economics, and it doesn't seem to me that if we were to teach economics at school, that it would necessarily be the type of economics or the type of sensible economics that, for example, we might agree on. It might be the economics of the state, and that certainly seems to be how they teach politics and stuff like critical thinking and general knowledge classes. So I'm wary about the state suddenly discovering a desire to teach economics.
But does it have to be the state? Why can't it be people like us?
Yes, I agree. I've always been an advocate for homeschooling. I think that, the state, like with healthcare, like with most things, the state needs to get out of education because, you look at the state of state education at the moment, it's absolutely terrible. Like, I'm seriously considering that if I have kids, I do not want them in any sort of state education whatsoever because I call them now conversion factories. I don't know what it is with academia, but people seem to be coming out more stupider than when they first went in. You're seeing this now with my generation, I think our generation, the people present, the millennial snowflake generation, is because the reason why they're called snowflakes is because they've been pampered and nurtured through academia. And then when they get spat out at the end, when they enter real life, they can't handle it. There's a great quote by Henry Ford that said that basically, I'm going to butcher it a bit, but basically paraphrasing is that if people understood how economics actually worked, there would be a revolution tomorrow. And the reason why economics is not properly taught in school and in this Bookshire Keynesian sort of style is taught is because it's broken. Our economy relies on people not understanding how the economy works. That's the reason why it is. Even things like home economics. When I go to people, what about home economics? They simply go, what, you mean making food? No, originally that's not what home economics meant. Think of it. Think of the name, the title. Home economics was about how to run your household and your money. It was about accounting. It was about paying the bills. It was about all of the basic things you do in your home via economics. But now the state has turned that into, cooking, That's not what it's about. These things have been purposely dumbed down because, like I say, our economy relies on people not understanding how the economy works. People don't understand that fiat currency is absolutely useless. The more we print, it totally devalues the currency. I'm very much in favor of gold standard and other cryptocurrencies as well. I think they are the future personally.
They are. Not going to say much more on it, but as you just said there, it's not taught properly in schools. I remember debating once a Labour supporter who studied politics and economics at sixth form, who was arguing to me that national debt is good for the economy. And I was so bewildered, I did not know how to respond. I was like, what? That makes no sense.
That's a prime example of this. Like I said, I call them indoctrination camps. They're turning to this, and I think this is the end result of a long march through the institutions. We've had, back in the 60s, the socialist-minded people. They tried to get in power via the ballot box, but this is the thing. I have faith in people. People aren't that stupid. They realized that they couldn't get power through the ballot box. So instead, they did it through infiltration. They've infiltrated every single aspect of society, whether it be academia or whether it be political. Even like we said earlier about the Conservative Party, they're not really conservatives anymore. Well, what do they conserve anymore? I can't work it out. It's the biggest mystery, I think, currently going on.
No, so we move now to the closing statements. Final thoughts on the lockdown, the situation, the experience of the past 3 months. Harley Dalton to start.
Thank you. So I just really wanted to pick up again on something that we discussed in this debate with regards to giving the government and the opposition the benefit of the doubt regarding hindsight. I think, as I mentioned before, the government took on the responsibility itself for tens of millions of people. And if you're going to do that, good intentions are rather irrelevant. What matters is what you actually did and who it hurt. As I said earlier on, remember that the government had a choice when it wasn't sure what to do, when it was trying to measure which way the wind was blowing. It could have gone with either pragmatism or principle, and I believe that they chose wrong. They decided that the ends justified the means, and in doing so flew in the face of hard-won and long-developed traditions of liberty in this country, and they've paid the price, as have we. The ends rarely justify the means when we're talking about government grand schemes. And as we've just discussed, the level of devastation that is going to reap upon this country already, as we're seeing with the loss of businesses, the loss of jobs, the increase in demands upon the welfare state, and the reductions in tax revenue to actually pay for it. There needs to be, I think, a reckoning for the devastation to our economy and society that the government has unleashed upon us. But at the same time, I'm not convinced that they will be. I think there are far too many armchair dictators for my liking, and far too few people conversant with even the basic tenets of British history, of our liberties, our freedoms, customs, and principles. I think it's going to be a long, painful, and probably quite aggressive period for the liberty movement to try and call it like it is in the face of the prevailing but flawed public perception that this was the right thing to do. We have gone down the wrong path, and there are far more dangerous wolves, if you like, waiting along it than just being stuck at home for 3 months. We ought to turn back before we actually get seriously bit by them.
And Sean Finch?
I still remain optimistic about what's going on. I think that this is going to be a great new chapter. It's going to be a new age of enlightenment, and people are going to realize that government are not the solution to everyone's problems. They're going to see that with hindsight, once this is all done, they're going to see that what the government did or what the state did is that draconian laws were introduced. Their businesses, if they're small business owners or medium business owners, were forced to close. Employees were forced to go on a furlong scheme and only accept 80% of their normal wage, and they've lost basically most of their livelihood. And with mental illness going up, the NHS is going to be hit by this as well. And I think that, as President Trump says, that the cure has become worse than the illness. And people are going to realize this, and the message of liberty has never been more relevant.
And James Hunt?
Thank you. First, I'd like to say at least I've enjoyed this. If we can maybe look towards the future for a moment instead of, worrying about what ifs and what has, this is a good opportunity for the liberty movement. This is a good opportunity for us to promote why we should never allow government to have this kind of power over us again, why we should never let them control our means of making money, why we should never let them control the movement of us as people, and just what we do in our daily lives. It's not for them to decide what's best for us, but ourselves. But what this will require is for the liberty movement not to be pacifist about it. We cannot any longer sit behind keyboards and just debate it, because this is what we've been doing so far, and look what it's resulted in: a government thinking it can do what it wants. A libertarian in the Conservative Party, the only thing he can offer is crying and banning people from speaking anything on Twitter. But if we revert to action, if we start informing people, I'd say educating, but that's just such a patronizing way of putting it, we might be able to turn this around. The economic damage will be hurtful. Social damage? No. Society's not existed in a long time that's been any good, so you know what, it does need a good kick up the backside. But our economics, at least, they're wrecked. But this might provide the reckoning needed to wake people up to the idea that statism and that government cannot solve your problems. The only person that can is you. It doesn't matter about your race, your gender, your sex, any sort of characteristics. The only person that really does matter and the only person that can change anything is you as the individual. But all of us together working with that mindset may be able to change things in the future for the better of everyone.
And finally, Chris Mendes.
So I think the lockdown has shown the reactionary, short-sighted and cowardly nature of our political class. We know the government listened to the wrong expert. 500,000 deaths was swiftly revised down to 20,000. The virus is dangerous for only a small portion of the population. If you're 65 plus, or if you have underlying health conditions, for example, but everyone else suffers from very mild symptoms. But if the virus was so deadly that it killed anybody and everybody as soon as it touched somebody, the complete lockdown policy might make a bit more sense. It was nowhere near that bad, nothing of the sort. It was a wrong policy. Government has made the situation worse and has created a multitude of fresh, serious, very, very serious economic problems for now and for the future going forward. It didn't need to do it, and yet that's what it's done. Parliament has shown yet again how unfit for purpose it is. When they want to protest Brexit, they can't stop talking. When the freedoms of millions are suppressed, they can't say anything, not a single one of them. And I think looking forward, the urgent problem we have right now is essentially that these powers that the government has seized and which Parliament has been complicit in, will they relinquish them? Will they retire those powers, or will they stay on the books? I'm reminded of that quote, I think, from Milton Friedman: nothing is as permanent as a temporary government programme. And my favourite example of this is income tax in 1842 was supposed to be a temporary measure. So I think people like us have got a huge job going forward to campaign for freedom and for liberty. They are important values, not just because we are concerned with the rights of the individual, but also because these values are highly productive values that are the primary source of prosperity and happy society. We are governed by a largely ignorant, careerist, empty vessel political class that think their clever ideas and their virtual signalling is the means to create wealth and opportunity and prosperity. Actually, it's not. It's our heritage, it's our history, it's our values, it's our freedom, it's our liberty, it's our democracy, and we trample on these at our peril. And so if nobody else in Parliament is going to stand up for these uniquely British values, then we'll do it instead.
Well, that has been a very intriguing experience. I think I was right to call it a discussion and not a debate, because it seems as though there's a lot of general agreement between the four participants. Well, thank you all for joining me.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Chris. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And if you'd like to help support the podcast and spread freedom and liberty to an even wider audience, please consider becoming a patron of The Libertarian Listener at patreon.com/The Libertarian Listener. And if you do, I thank you for your support. You can also visit the website, thelibertarianlistener.com, or head over to the Facebook page, and I'll provide a link to each of those in the description. Over the next few weeks, I'm going to be broadcasting the unheard extras from The Libertarian Listener that never made it to the final cut, so you've got that to look forward to. But that's it for this series, and The Libertarian Listener will return later in the year with coverage of the United States presidential election. See you then, and thank you for listening.